What if the life you've always dreamed of is just a prayer away? It's easy to feel stuck, overwhelmed by the chaos of daily life, and uncertain of which direction to take. But here's the truth. The moment you surrender your life to God, everything can change. Yes, everything. It sounds almost too simple, doesn't it? But the power of trusting God's guidance is life-altering. We all have our struggles, our doubts, and our fears, but what if those very obstacles are the starting point for a transformation you never imagined? God's not asking you to figure it all out on your own. He's asking you to trust His plan, to let Him lead you, and to be open to the radical changes He has in store for you. Maybe you've been waiting for a breakthrough or questioning why things aren't moving faster. You've prayed, but the answers seem slow in coming. The key is knowing that God's guidance is far more powerful than any of your own plans. It's not about rushing ahead, but about learning to trust that His timing is perfect, even when it feels like everything is on pause. If you're ready for real change, if you're ready to let go of your own grip on life and trust in the one who sees the bigger picture, then it's time to let God guide you. This isn't just about spiritual growth. It's about transformation at every level of your life. The best part? God is waiting for you to make that choice. It doesn't matter where you've been or what you've been through. Trusting God's path means opening your heart to endless possibilities, and it's never too late to start. In fact, this could be the exact moment God has been preparing for you all along. The question is, are you ready to step into it? Trust that God can lead you to a place of peace, purpose, and power like you've never known before. Let Him guide you and watch your life transform in ways you can't even imagine. Trusting in God is one of the most powerful acts a person can take in their journey of faith. It's like giving up control, but paradoxically, it's also the moment when life starts to feel lighter. Picture this. You're carrying a heavy load on your shoulders, and the moment you surrender it, everything changes. This is what trust in God offers. The Bible reminds us that when we trust God fully, we invite transformation into our lives. We might not always understand His plan, but trusting in Him opens doors to peace and clarity we didn't know were possible. When we face life's challenges, the urge to control everything can be overwhelming. But here's the thing. By praying and asking for God's guidance, we start to shift from a mindset of control to one of surrender. This doesn't mean we stop acting, but it means we lean on God's wisdom instead of our own understanding. Just like when you're lost in a forest, it's easy to panic. But when you trust that someone knows the way out, you can relax and let them lead you. That's what trusting in God feels like. Have you ever been stuck in a situation that seemed impossible to solve? Maybe it's a family issue, a career struggle, or a health scare. Trusting in God means stepping into the unknown, trusting that He sees what you can't. When you pray, ask Him for direction. You might not immediately see the road ahead, but there's a peace that comes with knowing He's guiding your steps. Trusting in God means taking one step at a time, even when you don't know exactly where it will lead. Consider the way a child trusts a parent. A child doesn't question whether their parent will take care of them. They trust that everything will work out, no matter the situation. God wants us to have that kind of trust in Him. When we lean on Him, especially in our moments of doubt or struggle, we open ourselves up to divine intervention. Prayer, with genuine trust, invites God to take the reins and transform our circumstances. It's not always easy to trust, though, especially when life throws curveballs. Sometimes, you might feel like you've been waiting forever for God's answer. But here's the secret. It's during these waiting periods that trust is truly tested. In those quiet moments, when it feels like nothing is happening, remember that God is always working behind the scenes. Trust in His timing, and your faith will grow stronger with each passing day. Every day is an opportunity to practice trust. Sometimes we're faced with small tests. Should we take that job, make that decision, or go down a new path? These are moments where trust in God becomes the foundation of our choices. By praying and seeking His guidance, we allow God to shape our lives. Trusting Him isn't passive. It's an active choice to surrender our will and accept His greater plan for our lives. The transformation begins in these moments of surrender. And as you grow in trust, you'll begin to notice changes in your life. the fear and uncertainty will diminish, replaced by a deep sense of peace and direction. But that's just the beginning. God's plan for you is grander than you can imagine. And when you start trusting Him more, He will reveal new depths of understanding that will change the course of your life forever. Imagine you're on a spaceship, traveling through the vastness of space. You're not the pilot, but you trust the one who is. You know they have the knowledge and the experience to get you safely to your destination. This is what trusting God is like. You may not be in control, but you have confidence that He is guiding your life with a plan far beyond what you can see. Just as the pilot has an understanding of the journey, God knows the bigger picture for your life. Trusting Him means believing that no matter how bumpy the ride may seem, He's always steering you toward your purpose. In the same way, trusting God involves letting go of the illusion of control. We might be tempted to micromanage every aspect of our lives, but when we trust, we release the need to handle it all. Just like passengers on a plane don't question the pilot's ability, we should rest assured in God's ability to guide us. Trusting Him doesn't mean we know the details of the journey, but it does mean we believe He'll get us where we need to go. That's faith in action. Think about it this way. If we tried to pilot the spaceship ourselves, it would be chaotic, wouldn't it? Yet when we surrender to God's plan, things begin to align. It's the same with life. We're not meant to have all the answers, and that's okay. The beauty of trust lies in acknowledging that God has the wisdom, the experience, and the love to direct our paths. And just like a spaceship is built with specific functions to reach its destination, our lives are designed with a unique purpose only God can fully understand. In your own life, this trust manifests in everyday decisions. Maybe you're facing a big life change, like moving to a new city or starting a new job. In moments like these, the idea of control feels more tempting than ever. But remember, just like the spaceship needs a pilot, you need God's guidance. You don't need to have every answer up front. You just need to trust that, with Him, the journey will unfold as it should. This trust allows you to step forward confidently, knowing you're not alone. This level of trust isn't built overnight, though. It grows over time, just like the relationship between a passenger and their pilot. At first, it might feel unsettling to relinquish control, but the more you trust God, the more peace you'll experience. It's like a muscle that strengthens with each use. The more you lean on Him, the more you'll see how He moves in your life, and you'll start to trust Him even more. Every step you take in trust opens doors you didn't even know were there. And the best part? God knows the destination even when you're still figuring it out. All it takes is that first step of trust. So the next time you feel the urge to control, remind yourself of the spaceship analogy. There's a trusted pilot at the helm, and you don't need to worry. Instead, let go and trust the journey. As we reflect on this, remember that trust in God is an ongoing journey, just like a spaceship reaching its final destination. And sometimes, that journey is about embracing the unknown. But how do we handle the moments of doubt, the times when we can't see the way forward? That's where God's unlimited perspective comes in. God's perspective is limitless, far beyond the confines of human understanding. We often look at our circumstances and feel overwhelmed by the weight of our challenges, but God sees the bigger picture. In the Bible, Jeremiah 29:11 reminds us that God has a plan for our lives, a plan for our welfare and not for evil, to give us a future and a hope. It's easy to get caught up in the moment and focus solely on our immediate problems, but God sees our entire journey, past, present, and future. Trusting in His perspective allows us to step back and see things from a new angle. Imagine trying to solve a complex puzzle. You're working on one piece at a time, and it feels slow and frustrating. But God, with His unlimited perspective, can see the entire picture in one glance. When you trust in His plan, you stop obsessing over every tiny detail and start to see how each piece fits together in its own time. It's like reading a book and only seeing the pages in front of you. But God, He can see the entire story and knows exactly where each chapter leads. This is the perspective He offers to those who trust Him. The beauty of this divine perspective is that it's rooted in love and wisdom. 2 Corinthians 4:18 encourages us to fix our eyes on what is unseen, not on what is seen. for what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. When we focus on God's view of our lives, we are reminded that our struggles, though real, are temporary. The trials we face today don't define us. They are part of a larger, eternal purpose that God is orchestrating. This knowledge can bring a sense of peace in the midst of hardship. It's like a tree growing in a forest. The tree doesn't know how far its roots stretch or what the horizon looks like. It simply grows, trusting that the soil and the water will provide what it needs. Similarly, we are asked to trust in God's vision for our lives, even when we can't see the end result. We may be in the middle of a storm, but God's perspective shows us that this storm is part of our growth, leading us to something greater. There are times when trusting in God's perspective might feel difficult. Maybe you're in a tough season and all you can see is the struggle. But take comfort in knowing that God's view is not limited by time or circumstance. He is already working out the details that will bring about your healing, success, and peace. Trusting in this higher perspective allows us to rest in His timing and purpose. It's not about knowing every detail, but about trusting that He knows what's best. When we embrace God's unlimited perspective, it changes the way we approach life's challenges. Instead of reacting out of fear or frustration, we can move forward with confidence, knowing that every situation is part of a bigger plan. This perspective opens our hearts to peace, hope, and joy, no matter what we're facing. And once we understand that God sees the full picture, we can begin to let go of the need to control and simply trust in His divine wisdom. But trusting in God's perspective isn't just about seeing the bigger picture. It's also about recognizing that His view of us is filled with grace and love. So, how can we apply this understanding of God's perspective in our daily lives? It's time to look at an example of someone who trusted in God's vision, no matter how hard things seemed. Abigail's story in 1 Samuel 25 is a beautiful example of trusting in God's wisdom and perspective in the face of a difficult situation. In the story, Abigail's husband Nabal insulted David, who had been protecting Nabal's property. David, understandably angry, planned to retaliate, but Abigail, knowing the dangers that lay ahead, acted swiftly. She didn't try to control the situation herself, nor did she react impulsively. Instead, she trusted God's timing and plan, humbling herself before David and offering a peace offering. Her trust in God's perspective prevented a tragedy and brought peace to her household. Abigail's trust wasn't passive, it was a bold act of faith. She recognized that the situation was beyond her ability to control, but she also knew that God was in charge. By stepping into the moment with wisdom, she became an instrument of peace. It wasn't about fighting fire with fire, it was about trusting that God would work in the hearts of those involved. This is a perfect example of how we can trust in God's timing, even when everything around us seems chaotic. When faced with challenges, it's easy to let our emotions take over. We want to fix things, sometimes rushing in without thinking things through. Abigail, however, took a moment to reflect, trust in God's direction, and acted in a way that was both wise and humble. Her actions were not motivated by fear or revenge, but by her deep trust in God's ability to resolve the situation. And in the end, God honored her faith by preventing violence and turning a potential disaster into a moment of reconciliation. Trusting God doesn't always mean avoiding conflict. Sometimes, it's about knowing how to navigate it with wisdom and grace. Abigail didn't shy away from the situation. Instead, she chose to act in a way that aligned with God's peace. This reminds us that when we trust God, we don't have to have all the answers or control the outcome. Our role is to be faithful, act wisely, and leave the rest to God. He is the one who ultimately orchestrates the results. In our own lives, we can take a page from Abigail's book. When faced with a difficult person or a situation that feels out of control, instead of reacting out of fear or frustration, we can trust that God has a plan for the moment. Sometimes it means taking a step back, praying, and asking for God's guidance before we respond. Like Abigail, we can be instruments of peace by trusting God's wisdom to handle the situation in the way that brings about the greatest good. Abigail's story shows us that trust in God can lead to miraculous outcomes, even in the most challenging circumstances. When we choose to trust God's perspective, We allow Him to guide our actions, bringing peace, resolution, and sometimes even unexpected blessings. But how do we continue to trust Him when things seem to be taking longer than we expect? That's where God's perfect timing comes into play. There's an old saying that timing is everything, and when it comes to trusting in God, this couldn't be truer. Ecclesiastes 3:1 reminds us that there is a time for everything under the sun. Each season of our lives has its purpose. We often find ourselves rushing, pushing for results on our own timeline. But trusting in God means understanding that His timing is perfect. His perspective sees the entire scope of our lives, and He knows exactly when things need to happen for our highest good. Sometimes the waiting period is just as important as the result itself. Think about the story of Esther. In the Bible, Esther was a young woman who found herself in a position of great influence, but also in a time of immense danger for her people. It seemed like there was no way to save the Jews from destruction. Yet Esther didn't act hastily. She waited for God's perfect timing. When the time was right, she boldly stepped forward, and her actions led to the salvation of her people. God had placed her in a specific moment of history, and her trust in His timing led to an extraordinary outcome. Waiting can be incredibly frustrating, especially when we're waiting for something important to change or happen in our lives. But when we trust God's perfect timing, we acknowledge that He's working things out in the background, even when we can't see it. It's like planting a seed. It doesn't sprout immediately, but with time, the right conditions, and care, it will bloom. God's timing is similar. He's nurturing the circumstances and people around us, preparing them for the perfect moment when everything will come together. When we surrender our timeline to God, we free ourselves from the anxiety of trying to control everything. Imagine you're driving in the fog. Your vision is limited, and you can't see too far ahead. But the road is clear ahead, even if you can't see it yet. Trusting in God's timing means knowing that He sees the road ahead, even when we don't. We may not understand why things aren't happening as quickly as we'd like, but in the end, we'll see how God's perfect timing orchestrates everything for our benefit. There are many times in life when we want things to happen on our terms. But the key to trusting God's timing is recognizing that our impatience can sometimes get in the way of what He's doing in our lives. Just as a flower needs time to grow, so do our hearts and lives. God's timing allows us to mature and be prepared for the blessings He wants to give us. If we act too soon, we might miss out on what He has in store. So how do we embrace this divine timing? It starts with patience. We pray, trusting that God's timing is perfect. When we're in the midst of waiting, we don't have to do nothing. Faith requires action, but our actions should be guided by trust in God's timing. Knowing that when the time is right, He will open the door, and we'll be ready. This trust leads to peace, even in times of waiting, knowing that God is preparing us for what's next. But how do we hold on to this patience in moments of uncertainty? Sometimes it's easier said than done. That's where the real strength comes, finding strength in our weakness through God's grace. There's a paradox in the Christian faith that many of us struggle to understand. It's in our weakness that God's strength is most clearly revealed. In 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9, Paul shares a profound truth when he writes, "But He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." This verse teaches us that when we acknowledge our weakness, we open ourselves to God's limitless strength. It's counterintuitive, right? But when we stop trying to hold everything together on our own, that's when God steps in and works His wonders in our lives. Think of it like lifting weights. When you try to lift too much on your own, you struggle, and you might even fail. But with a spotter, someone who knows exactly how much you can handle, you can lift more than you ever thought possible. In the same way, when we embrace our weaknesses and surrender them to God, He becomes the strength that carries us through. It's not about pretending we're invincible or having all the answers. It's about acknowledging that we need help and allowing God's power to flow through us. The story of Gideon in Judges 6 is another powerful example of God using weakness to bring about His purpose. Gideon was hesitant, filled with doubt, and considered himself the least in his family. But God saw something in him that Gideon couldn't see himself. God saw potential, strength, and courage. Through his weakness, Gideon became a mighty warrior, not because of his own abilities, but because he trusted God to provide the strength he needed. This is the kind of transformation that happens when we rely on God's strength rather than our own. It's often in the darkest times that God's strength shines brightest. Maybe you're facing a situation that seems beyond your ability to handle, or you're feeling overwhelmed by your own limitations. But take heart. God specializes in using weak vessels to accomplish his incredible work. The key is to trust that in your vulnerability, God can display his power in ways you never imagined. It's a humbling experience, but also a deeply liberating one. When you stop fighting against your limitations, you'll see how God can turn them into opportunities for growth and victory. Many of us are afraid to admit our weaknesses because we think it makes us look weak or incapable. But in the kingdom of God, weakness is not something to hide. It's an invitation for God to move. When we acknowledge our need for him, we position ourselves to experience his grace and strength in profound ways. The next time you feel weak, instead of getting frustrated or discouraged, see it as a moment to surrender to God's power and watch how he'll use it for his glory. Remember, our weaknesses don't disqualify us from God's purpose. They make us more dependent on him, and in that dependence we find strength. It's in embracing our fragility that we find the strength to endure, grow, and achieve what we once thought impossible. As we do so, we begin to trust not only in God's strength, but also in his perfect timing. That's when we start to see how everything, even our weakest moments, fits perfectly into his plan. But how do we continue to grow in trust and patience while we wait for God's perfect timing? How can we apply this to our daily lives? Prayer and action play a big role. Prayer and action go hand in hand when we're trusting in God's plan. Prayer isn't just about asking God for what we want or need. It's also about aligning our hearts with his will and acknowledging that we can't do it alone. It's in those quiet moments of prayer that we surrender our weaknesses, doubts, and fears to God, trusting that he will provide the guidance and strength we need. And once we've prayed, the next step is action. God doesn't want us to sit idly by and wait for things to happen. He calls us to take steps of faith, trusting that he's with us every step of the way. Think about the story of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. God could have parted the waters without any action from the Israelites, but instead, he asked Moses to stretch out his hand. It wasn't until Moses took that first step of faith that the sea parted. God had a plan, but the Israelites had to be willing to step into the unknown and trust that God would do the impossible. In our own lives, God may not part a sea for us, but he is always calling us to take steps of faith, even when we can't see the entire path ahead. When we pray, we're not just asking God for intervention, we're also preparing our hearts and minds for the action he's calling us to take. Maybe it's a step of forgiveness, a leap of faith in a new opportunity, or the courage to make a difficult decision. Prayer helps us get clarity and peace in the midst of uncertainty. It opens our hearts to God's direction, and when we're ready to act, we do so with confidence, knowing that God is guiding our steps. Action without prayer can feel like we're doing things on our own strength, but prayer without action can lead to stagnation. It's the balance of both that propels us forward. Prayer is the fuel that ignites our faith, and action is the vehicle that drives it. God has given us the ability to make decisions, to act, and to move forward. But it's his guidance through prayer that ensures we're walking in the right direction. So, how do we approach prayer and action in our lives? Start by praying for wisdom, asking God to reveal the next step. Then take that step in faith. Whether it's a small decision or a big one, trust that God is with you, guiding your every move. And remember, the action doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be taken with trust in God's direction. He can turn our small steps into something great when we move in faith. When we combine prayer and action, we begin to see how God is working in our lives. The transformation we seek isn't always instant, but with each prayer and step forward, we grow closer to the plan he has for us. Through this process, we become more attuned to his voice, more confident in his timing, and more willing to trust that he's already orchestrating the details of our lives. Now that you've learned how trusting God can transform your life, the real question is, will you put this knowledge into action? Trust isn't just something you say, it's something you live. It's in the small, everyday choices, surrendering your worries, leaning into His timing, and taking those steps of faith, even when you don't have all the answers. But here's the thing. Each step you take with God's guidance brings you closer to the life He's prepared for you. So ask yourself, what is God calling you to trust Him with today? Is there a situation you've been holding on to too tightly? A worry you've been carrying that you need to lay at His feet? The beauty of trusting God is that He's always there, ready to guide, support, and transform you. You don't have to figure it all out alone. By opening your heart to His perfect timing and strength, you'll begin to experience a peace and joy that only comes from walking in His will. But it all starts with you, your willingness to trust, to pray, and to take action. If you're ready to let God guide you and transform your path, the first step is simple. Say yes. Say yes to His plan. Say yes to His timing. Say yes to the peace that comes from trusting Him. If you found this journey of faith inspiring, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you can continue learning about how trusting God can bring real, lasting transformation to your life. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Are you ready to take that first step?